And then at a certain point, when Socrates feels like that point has been made, he, in a way, pushes it a little bit further and goes back into this zone of, like, what should a politician do in a democracy and why? Okay? And can politicians actually accomplish anything good for people, or are they always bad? Okay? Because in a way, he's thinking of Gorgias probably even more than Callicles, because Gorgias is a sort of politician and is definitely a teacher of those who aspire to be politicians. And that's where this whole dialogue began. And so we're also back to this question of, what is the value of democracy? Can it work? Can it work at all? Is it always the case that, say, public speakers kind of manipulate crowds, or, is there some way to rescue that tendency, right? Well, I don't know if he totally answers that question. I'm pretty sure Socrates, to the end of his life, thought that democracy had some serious problems and that good leadership in democracies was unlikely because of the dynamics that we've studied. And yet, it's not impossible, right? And I think this is what he's getting at when he starts to talk about the true orator in this dialogue, in the true public speaker, when he starts to talk about that, okay? So he's going to try to answer the question, is rhetoric ever used well, right? Is it ever used to actually improve people? Because remember what he said back a ways. He said the only reason for rhetoric would be if it improved people, even if it meant using it to turn in your family members and friends, right? Because just punishment might improve their character, right? So is there a way that a democratic politician, is there any chance of such a figure actually improving people in their character? Because that's what he's concerned about. He's not too concerned about the economy, for instance. You don't hear Socrates talk about, how well off people are in Athenian society. He kind of assumes most people are going to be poor. That's just the way it was, right? But what mattered to him was, what is the character of the people, right? Do they have self-control? Do they put their efforts into things that are of value, right? And can there be a leader that encourages them to do that through their political rhetoric, okay? And we can kind of think of that question in the background of the way that Plato thought in terms of regimes, different types of regimes. And in the Republic, which you didn't read, but it's definitely it's a much longer book, and it's his most famous book, Plato kind of ranks different kind of regimes or forms of government according to how well they do in this regard of improving people's character and making people just. And he actually says that the best form of regime, which is very, very unlikely to ever occur in real life, is the rule of philosopher kings, where the wise rule, right? Whether it's a singular wise person or a group of wise people, right? So another term for this would be aristocracy, the rule of the wise, right? But it's very unlikely to happen because people don't respect the wise, right? They don't want to listen to somebody that claims to know something more than they do. So a lot of the Republic is about why is it that people reject folks that know something, right, when it comes to government. So anyway, that's kind of almost off the table. But if you could imagine somebody who knew well, what would work and what would make people happy through bettering their character, it would be that. Then one step down from that, according to Plato, is timocracy, which is rule by the military, basically. Why? Well, because the Athenian military, Greek military more generally, was motivated by honor. And wisdom is higher than honor, but honor comes right after wisdom as far as it being a motivation that improves your character. If you're motivated by honor, you try to do things that will bring approval and admiration from others, where they might admire you as a hero, like risking your life or risking your your own well-being for the sake of your society somehow. So people who are motivated by honor, they're courageous in nature because they will sacrifice even their lives for the sake of their country if it will actually make their country better or safer somehow. So they kind of have a type of wisdom, but it's a little bit lower type than the ultimate wisdom, if that makes sense. But it's still way up there. Right? And in his view, a much higher motivation than just maybe money, okay? So the third type of regime that's lower than these two, in his view, was oligarchy, which is ruled by the wealthy, right? And in that type of regime, the wealthy rule mainly for their own betterment, but they see that there's a connection between their betterment, their wealth, and the well-being of their society. So they have some interest in ruling in a way that will keep workers happy and kind of keep crime down and keep people orderly so that they can maintain their wealth, okay, and maybe grow their wealth. And they have a type of wisdom too. It's the type of wisdom that's born of kind of like self-interest, of enlightened long-term self-interest, where they're capable of thinking strategically about what it would take to keep them well off, okay? So it is not that terrible of a regime, right? Because there's order, there's, arguably people will be better off with order, and people aren't treated like absolute garbage because they are part of the economy that enriches the wealthy people, okay? So even that's better. And another nice thing about oligarchy, he says, is that it has people who know how to control themselves, because in order to make and keep money, you have to have self-control. You need to sometimes delay your gratification. You need to not wallow in, luxury, because then you just lose it all, right? So good oligarchs, unless they're like extremely wealthy, I suppose, but good oligarchs have to continue to be sober and not just squander their wealth. They need to have self-control. So that's a virtue that they have. So you see, their true wisdom, honor, and self-control, right? Those are virtues that these people have. And then fourth on his list, underneath these three, in order of worthiness, is democracy. And in the Republic, he talks about how democracy at its best is like a quilt woven out of many different fabrics, right? It puts together people of all different kinds, rich and poor, sometimes from different countries and so on and so forth. And it can be this beautiful, colorful, but kind of disorderly society, right? Where there isn't full agreement and there isn't one virtue that is valued above the others. The thing that's valued the most in a democracy is equality. And everybody can kind of agree that everybody else should be treated like an equal citizen, right? And that's what unifies them, if anything. But other than that, freedom is the main thing in a democracy, and people can kind of live the way they want to. So if you want to make money, you can do that and be respected. If you want to be a soldier, you can do that. Right? If you want to be an intellectual and philosophize all day, you can do that. If you want to be an artist, you can do that. He even goes so far to say in the Republic that in a democracy, even the animals become a little bit more respected, right? That even the animals are treated almost like citizens by the people of a democracy if they want to, right? And so it's delightful, and it contains a lot of freedom. And for that reason, it's not all bad. Another thing he says about democracy is because it's made out of so many different types of people with all kinds of different interests, it kind of bungles along. So it's less capable of doing anything super harmful because there's not enough agreement in society for it to actually focus enough to like do something harmful, okay? So a lot of times it doesn't achieve as much greatness, although in the case of Athens, it did. But normally, you know, it's less likely to achieve greatness, but it is a place where Socrates, his teacher, Plato's teacher, wanted to live because he was, until he got executed, he was relatively like free to say whatever the heck he wanted and gain his own little set of students that would listen to him and try to have some influence. And he loved that. That's why even when he did get blamed for the loss of the Peloponnesian War and scapegoated, he didn't want to escape from prison. He decided that he would rather just die at that point. Okay. So he was not a total enemy of democracy, but the main problem with democracy, as we have all learned now, in his view, is that it is too vulnerable to the demagogue, which is the type of politician who uses this speech to become popular and then rule like a monarch. And that tends to happen when people are under stress, like during a wartime period or, you know, a plague, you know, where everybody is feels endangered. When people are at high risk, then they will turn their society over to a monarch. They sort of revert back to monarchy. They make somebody a king, more or less, okay? And that then becomes the end of their democracy. So, and this is actually the cycle that the regimes will go through. Democracies, let's just rule this out, but like democracies are vulnerable to turning into oligarchies as the people involved in the democracy start to make money due to their conquests, and they start to have this interest in preserving it and growing it, so they start thinking more of money than honor. And oligarchs, he says, have children who don't really care about self-control because they grew up with massive wealth and they've wallowed in luxury and they have no self-discipline, so they turn into democratic types who don't want to follow in their father's footsteps. And then in democracy, people don't have enough knowledge of their values left to really know what's a good or a bad leader, and so they're too susceptible to the tyrant taking over. Once you're at this point, anything can happen, and you just have to start over again at some point. So, well, you know, in this mix, democracy, you'll notice, is not at the bottom. And he himself benefited from living in one. And so this is why, I think, Socrates spends time on this concept of the true orator here, okay? And that's probably why he's talking to these guys to begin with, especially Polus and Chaerephon, who are young, and they still have a point in their lives where they could maybe have better values and want to rule more like an aristocrat or like some sort of soldier, right? Who had some sense of virtue that they could use to make their society better, okay? So this is why he's talking to them in the first place. I think he thinks that democracy, as clumsy and as vulnerable as it is maybe in most situations the best practicable choice, the one that you would hope for, okay? Because all these other ones are likely to somehow abuse, except for the aristocracy, they're likely to abuse somebody, okay? And they're likely to not last very long. And that value of democracy kind of bumbling along and usually not harming too many people is fairly valuable, okay? And honestly, he didn't want to live under any other kind of regime because they don't respect philosophers. Outside of democracies, philosophers don't have a job because nobody wants to listen to them, right? And you could put into that category journalists and scholars and pretty much anybody who, you know, sort of thinks for a living, teachers and so on, right? So in a democracy, his type of thing could thrive, right? So this is why I think he's not giving up on democracy, and instead, towards the end of this dialogue, starts talking about what kind of, how could rhetoric be used for the good, to reinforce democracy, to kind of preserve this not perfect but still relatively preferable regime. Okay, so he starts to describe who this and what that would look like, right? A true orator or public speaker, he says, is someone who, first of all, has the goal of making the souls of his citizens just, which I realize is very old-fashioned language, but it means the top aim of government is to produce good people with good characters. That's more important than, winning wars or making money. The most important thing is good character. So they need to be able to use their speech to kind of inspire people to be good. Well, what does that mean in a democracy? Well, to be good citizens, right? So to pay attention to what's going on, to have an informed opinion. Also just to be good community members, taking care of themselves, their families, and other people, contributing to society in a way that benefits all, okay? So, a really inspiring leader will be able to turn people's heads and make them feel enthusiastic about being that type of person, right? It's been a while. I can't really think in the past 20 or 30 years when I can really give an excellent example. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, we don't have a really good example of this consistently, but maybe you can think of something, right? Where the public speaking was almost always aimed at be a good person. And here's what a good person looks like, right? It's been on many other topics in the United States that are more practical of nature, right? Like jobs and the economy. And those things are important, but like I said, for Socrates, the bedrock was the character of the people. So if you didn't have that, these other things were not probably going to happen anyway. And then they used their speech, he says, to instill order, virtue, and temperance, which means moderation. Okay, remember the argument that he had with Callicles, where Callicles said, a moderate or temperate person is almost like a dead man. In order to live your life, you have to live it to its fullest and let your desires go to the fullest extent possible, and anything less was terrible, right? That's his answer to this. He says, no, actually the opposite. Only if a leader actually discourages this type of mentality in himself and in other people, will he have a society that actually hangs together enough to accomplish anything, right? But the most important accomplishment is simply good character. That makes his way of thinking very different from a modern way of thinking, right? When we hear that, I don't know about now, but in the past when students heard that, the thing that came to their mind was, oh, so Socrates actually wants to teach us his version of morality and impose it on us, right? We're a free country. We can have our own morality or no morality at all. Freedom is paramount, even if it means we're bad people, right? Because there is no such thing as bad, okay? Socrates just didn't buy it, In his view, there is such a thing as bad. There's such a thing as good. Hopefully you picked up on that. It is not relative. It is not a matter of opinion, right? And that is not freedom to be able to kind of be a bad person if you want to be. Okay? Because you're not fulfilling your own nature as a human being if you just go down the path of these other sort of what he deems to be bad values. So if you're primarily, constantly pursuing your desires, whether they're for material objects or something else, you are in that addictive state. You are degrading your nature. It sounds really judgmental, because it kind of is, but he thinks he has reasons for it, right, that are compelling. Right? A good leader doesn't encourage their citizens to degrade their human nature, but lifts them up to be human rather than kind of descending towards the animal kingdom. I know that's somewhat prejudicial towards animals, but later Neoplatonists kind of put it really bluntly that way. They said, we've got the mineral, like the dirt of the earth, the mineral, we've got the plant life, we've got the animal, then we've got the human, and the human, if they dwell primarily in these other lower levels, is not quite human. So the goal of a government and leadership should be to human flourishing, right? So definitely that came from Plato. And so what he's saying here is, like, if one is truly gifted with the power of public speaking, to use that gift to just enthuse people to make themselves better is the highest purpose for public speaking. Okay? So you can see how the people that he's responding, that he's being, who are listening to him, whose goals are kind of the opposite of that, or they don't really care about people's character, they are not too happy right now. Okay, let's think about Gorgias, right? Gorgias said he would teach people how to be good if they really didn't know that, but they probably knew it already, and his primary business was to help the speaker get what he desires, namely power and wealth. And Polus, his student, was paying him money so that he could teach him that skill, because he aspired to be like Archelaus, the tyrant, even though he was in a democracy, right? To be able to rule like that, like that's what Polus wanted. Chaerephon, we don't know. He's out of the picture. He's been out of the picture for quite some time, right? And then Callicles doesn't even, there's no pretense with Callicles. He doesn't really care about being a democratic politician or learning that skill. He's truly some sort of, maybe closer to an oligarch or a tyrant, right? The type of system that he would want is one where he didn't have to try to persuade anybody of anything, let alone make them good people. They just need to work for him. Okay? So with all of this that Socrates has said, right, it shouldn't be surprising that Callicles reacts very strongly. Okay? Yeah. Let me see if I can find this, because I want to read just a little bit more of it. Yeah, so this is on my page 80. And he, up above that, he says, I haven't a notion of what you're getting at, Socrates. Suppose you try your questions to someone else. And he also says, I don't give a damn for a single word you say. I only answered your questions to please Gorgias, right? So that's a pretty violent reaction. And, you know, and I know that you've noticed, like, all along the way, Callicles has kind of reluctantly agreed to all these little steps that Socrates has made. But here you see that Callicles doesn't actually agree with any of it, and never did. So he went along, maybe because he really didn't care too much about the conversation, or because he couldn't, in the moment, you know, figure out what else to say. And this is kind of significant, Socrates hasn't changed his character, right? Like, all of his dialoguing hasn't changed Callicles' character. Socrates says, well, what shall we do now? Break off the argument in the middle? Callicles says, you're the judge. So pretty soon, Socrates is kind of on his own, because Callicles just drops out, you know, like functionally drops out, right? And I have a question here. If Callicles refuses to accept defeat, is he defeated? Okay? That's a good, I think it's a good question, right? And I think that maybe it gets to the heart of the lack of power that somebody like Socrates has. You know, he can dialogue with this guy all day long, but if Callicles isn't open to kind of changing, you know, really kind of absorbing his arguments and changing, he's just not going to change. So the answer to somebody like Socrates who wants to reason with you can just be no, right? And then how much power does Socrates have? Did he really make any difference with Callicles? He went into the conversation with his mind made up, right? Which a lot of people do in any sort of debate or conversation, and so did not really consider the arguments, didn't kind of open up the door to, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe let's see, right? So it matters a lot when it comes to dialoguing or having these types of conversations with a person, if they are open to maybe admitting that they might be wrong on some things. If they don't, then that person retains all their power, right? And they can simply say, at the end, I don't agree, and you will not have changed them. So that's what Socrates is confronting. He went into it closed, and he remained closed, and none of the techniques that Socrates used jarred him off of being closed, right? Sometimes they do, like you saw with Gorgias in particular, that he did kind of move a little bit, and maybe he was a little bit more curious about what Socrates was saying, whereas Callicles is pretty hardened and pretty smart. He's the smartest person there except for Socrates. He's got a really well-developed position. He told you about it. So he didn't lose this argument. That's my point, right? He didn't lose the argument because he just simply refused to accept it. And that's an act of will, right? Not an act of reason. And that kind of shows you the limits of reason, right? Which I think is an important thing to absorb from a dialogue like this. If you think that you can change people's minds merely by reasoning with them, most of the time that does not work. And that's something that Socrates learned there, right? And maybe that's another reason why Plato in this dialogue wants to talk about effective rhetoric, because maybe he knows that there's a point where that works better when appealing to people's emotions and their feelings and kind of meeting them where they're at actually works better. So you don't necessarily want to throw that out. Okay? We all know that reasoning is not always effective, even if it's really good. And that's why this guy, so famous for this one quote, Lytton said, "Beneath the rule of men entirely great, the pen is mightier than the sword." He was trying to assert that, okay? In this particular instance, it doesn't seem to be true, right? But he wanted to believe it was true. The sword, Callicles' sword, in a way, seems to be mightier here. And there is one way in which he would be correct. The reason why we know who Callicles is because of Plato, right? In fact, Callicles was probably an agglomeration of several characters and wasn't a real person. But the reason why we know about that is because of the dialogue is still with us, right? And when Lytton wrote that, that's the kind of thing he was talking about. If you take a step back from those immediate arguments and you look at what actually moves and shapes entire societies for centuries, right? Throughout the course of human history, it's ideas. So that's why he says that, right? Whether it's like the American founders, James Madison, Adam Smith, one of the fathers of, capitalist economics, Karl Marx, granddaddy of communism, right? These people, including Plato and Aristotle highly influential on the development of Christian theology and Western philosophy, even though they might have been despised or ignored or kind of not too relevant at their time, we know who they are, right? And over the course of time, they literally founded entire civilizations, right? And so in the long run, one could indeed argue that the pen is mightier than the sword, but it isn't mightier in the immediate argument, right? In fact, the guy with the pen could just get killed. That would be the end of his argument. Socrates got killed. It's part of the reason why we still know he existed and we know his ideas. Okay? Sometimes getting killed for the reasons that people are being killed actually heightens their fame and makes them more memorable. Okay? So that's the sense in which the pen is mightier than the sword from this perspective, and probably the reason why Socrates decided not to flee Athens when he was accused, because he valued his ideas higher than his life, and he wanted to make sure that he lived consistently until the end, because he wanted them to have traction. He had people who followed his ideas, and he wanted them to go out in the world and keep them going, and they indeed did. And they have legs all the way to 2025. So the pen is mightier than the sword in that respect, but in the moment, it not necessarily is, right? So then, having kind of like dwelled on this for a while, we come back to this question of who is the coward? And Socrates directly addresses this at this point and makes a fairly decent accusation, okay? He says that the type of person that just wants to practice rhetoric in order to make themselves safer, more powerful, wealthier, is actually concentrating too much on their survival and not enough on their impact on the greater good, right? And that is cowardly in his view, right? It is a sort of self-protection mechanism that narrows their frame of vision so that they can't truly be heroic, so that they can't actually expand themselves, and so that they can't have the freedom to act how they might otherwise want to. People like Polus and Gorgias and Callicles sort of see the world as they are constrained to compete, and they are constrained to fight back and, fight fire with fire, okay? And grab the power so you can dictate the rules rather than be a victim. Remember that conversation, right? So they are driven in a way, according to this, which is almost psychoanalysis, by fear, okay? So basically he is saying that way of life that you seek is based on fear, and it limits your freedom. So he starts to make this speech all on his own. It's kind of the precursor to the ultimate speech about heaven and hell that he talks about at the end. He says, first of all, this is Socrates, he says, I deny, Callicles, that to be vulnerable to abuse is the worst fate, and you haven't refuted my reasons. So he brings up the whole theme of reason here, and you haven't reasoned well, and therefore I technically won anyway, right? And then he says, it is men like you who are cowardly. And this quote kind of sums it up. He says, do you, Callicles, really think that this is the object of our lives, to live as long as possible, to lavish all our care upon the cultivation of those arts, those talents, which may save us from danger, just as you keep urging me to cultivate the rhetoric that would keep me safe in the law courts, right? If he had been a good rhetorician in that court case where he was condemned to death, he could have gotten off. In fact, people were begging him to just say something that would allow them, and he didn't do that, see? So this is Plato kind of making Socrates the hero. This is the guy who had the courage to die for his convictions. This is the guy that had the military timocratic virtue of courage and honor, and wasn't craven and greedy and manipulative, but rather lived his life in a heroic fashion. So it's Plato kind of trying to defend his teacher's courage and his position against somebody like Callicles, Gorgias, and Polus, who wouldn't see that as a wise move at all, right? And would see themselves as tough and admirable, maybe not heroic, that might be for chumps, but tough and smart and great and powerful, right? As opposed to poor Socrates, who ends up just getting killed, right? This is Plato's answer to all that in his defense of his teacher, okay? And then we have Socrates. Remember how Callicles gave Socrates advice about, hey, just go into business, or into politics. You have a good brain, right? So here's Socrates saying to Callicles the opposite. He says, consider, my dear friend, whether what is noble and good may not be something rather than the mere saving of human life, whether existence over however many years is not something which a human being who is at the same time a rational man must disregard. He must not cling to life, but surrender to such considerations to God, and to have faith in the old wives' proverb that none can escape his destiny. Thereafter he must reflect upon how he may best employ his allotted span of years. Whether, for instance, he should adapt himself to the government under which he happens to be living. That is, in the present case, whether you should make yourself as similar as possible to the Athenian people, since you intend to be congenial to it, friendly to it, and to acquire great power in the state. People who want to have power in the democracy, like they do, and he's kind of lumping Callicles in here, have to flatter people and spend all their lives trying to figure out how to pander to them and shape their rhetoric and their lives around their, desires and what they want to hear. That doesn't seem like a very noble way of life to Socrates, right? So he's giving Callicles this advice, be a man, have some courage. Are you so afraid of dying that you just will flatter people your entire life and spend all of your intellectual and physical and emotional energy manipulating people to protect yourself? Okay. Does that seem like a very courageous, manly thing to do? He doesn't think so. Right? So he doesn't really get down in the gutter here, but he's definitely answering back, and he's not shy about this theme of courage and cowardice. And he's telling Callicles, you are a coward. Okay. It's interesting. I wonder what psychoanalysis would have to say about this commentary at this point in time, right? Because now we know that bullies tend to be cowards on the inside and all of that, right? Self-protection based on their speech and their manipulation and stuff. And so deep on the inside, they're one step away from freaking out and melting down, but they hang it together, right? So I think that's kind of where he's coming from. What a cool conversation it would be if he could meet up with a psychologist, but he doesn't. But he, for ancient times he was kind of a psychologist because he was an astute student of human nature. Okay, so this is his answer to Callicles, and to all politicians. He's saying other things are more important. Why do you want to flatter people? Is that a good use of your life? The one life you have to live, you're going to spend in this sort of craven manner, or are you going to get a spine and kind of say what you really believe and hopefully have higher goals than that, right? And of course that dovetails into what he's teaching, right? So it's a defense of him and his way of teaching the young people, which is to focus on character. If they focus on character, they'll have enough courage to stand firm, even if it somewhat hurts them in the moment to do so. Okay. That's what his message is, right? So this is not a complete condemnation of politicians. I hope people notice, right? It's not saying, politicians, the life of the politician is always wrong. It's saying that it's rare to come up with to find a politician who will do this, but we need those politicians. We need leaders who can use their speech to make people better and risk losing in order to do that. Okay. We need people with courage. That's what he's saying. Okay? And his answer to Polus and Gorgias and Callicles is that their eat-or-be-eaten approach is cowardly, harmful, not only to others, but also to themselves, because they're wasting their life away on something that's ignoble, right? And that causes anxiety and worry and fear. Remember the example of Archelaus and how, once a person gets to that point where they really are kind of a tyrant, they have to fear others attacking them, right? So then they have to constantly be figuring out, well, how do I protect myself against all that? And then that absorbs all of their mental energy, right? So at a certain point, it makes sense, in his view, to simply be smart, but risk, like take a risk, and life may be a little shorter, but it might be better lived, yeah, a life worth living, because, eternal life is more important than this fleeting amount of time that he thinks we spend here. He has a sort of religious mythology. It kind of dovetails a little bit with a certain type of Christian theology, which is interesting. He has like a heaven and a hell. He has like cosmic judgment. Actually, his description was picked up by early Christian theologians, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And that might help for you to understand why he disregarded life past a certain point, but his previous reasons are also they also do kind of stand on their own. You can either accept them or reject them on their own.